Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Phil Guerin. I'm a technical account manager here with Cavello, and we're doing yet another one of our monthly webinar series. We're going to be speaking about the product again today, but with a focus more on how to be effective around things as what would seemingly be as simple as like a data retention policy. And then obviously, how measuring your data and having the insights beyond just how old certain data types might be or certain files might be can potentially go quite a long way in terms of retaining the right data and then keeping things protected until the point where you can adequately remove it. I'm just going to wait a minute or two here while final attendees come in, and then we'll kind of just go through that again. And we're a couple minutes past the hour here, so I'm going to start in about 60 seconds or so. Same format as always. If anything here sparks an interest, you want to ask a question, please feel free to drop that in the chat, and the team here will raise that to me. I'll do my best to read off the question for the benefit of others before just jumping into things. But don't feel like you need to keep your questions until the end. Please feel free and jump in when you see something that interests you. As well, if you've got an idea in terms of a use case to focus on or a particular challenge to focus on, especially as it relates to your data sensitivity, any kind of an impact of that data being used against you, again, please reach out to us, let us know. We're happy to use one of these sessions to focus on something meaningful to you as well. Cool, so we're just gonna dive right in here. So once again, my name is Phil. I'm a technical account manager here with Cavello. We do this conversation on a monthly basis to be able to give people the chance to drop in, ask questions, and just hear some information in terms of how effectively measuring your data is going to lead to success in a number of your organization's activities. Today being centered around the more simple idea of data retention. Let's skip on to the next part. So we hear this a lot, right? Digital transformation, on-prem to cloud migrations. We're growing, we're scaling. I mean, at the end of the day, all this really means is we have more people, we have more devices, and we're more data driven than ever, which means as a digital asset, as a human being, as an organization or a team within one, we're just generating and using more and more and more data every week, every month, every quarter, and there's absolutely zero sign of any of that slowing down. So data growth is going to remain exponential and unchecked. We're not just going from on-prem to cloud anymore, right? 5-10 years ago, maybe I'm just going to lift and shift my on-prem servers into a virtual replication of that on-prem. The reality now is there's so many different organizations and vendors offering targeted solutions within that cloud space that becomes part of the lens of consideration, right? I'm not just going to move everything up into an EC2 instance. I'm going to move it into a service that offers me a whole lot of other features and protection and scale beyond just lifting and shifting my server, which means we're adopting multiple cloud instances, right? So it's not just on-prem to one cloud. It's multi-on-prem to multi-cloud with infinitely, not infinitely, but exponentially growing data sets. And that data proliferates everything, right? We know where we're supposed to be storing that information in terms of maybe we have a conversation up front if we're into that kind of data hygiene side of the organization, where should we be storing data? But the reality is we write down policies on a piece of paper. We train our human beings on what they should be doing. And then the reality tends to ebb and flow from there, right? And typically this isn't people making malicious actions for the sake of making malicious actions. The vast majority of your staff are just focused on getting their job done, right? They got POs they got to get out, they have deadlines that they need to hit, they need access, and they need to work with data and those work products in order to get it done. So if there's a way for data to move, like we always say, it's going to proliferate any of the boundaries that you think are going to keep it where it's going to be kept, unless you have a continual eye on it. And now when breaches happen, People don't just typically breach data that doesn't make any sense, right? Unfortunately, when breaches happen, it involves employee data, and it involves user data, and it involves intellectual property and a variation of other data sets, all of which individually and in conjunction with one another can be used to a detrimental financial impact back to not only the organization, but the users that those pieces of data are associated to. So the reason why I say this, we work with a lot of different customers that they won't really even know all of the data that they're bringing into their organization because they're bringing in big packages of data from other clients and other firms and other vendors. And unless you're really measuring this on a regular basis, you don't know what's there. And even if it's not supposed to be there and it gets caught up in a breach, that data was in your hands, right? That data was on your systems. It was in the bounds of your digital walls. It was within your responsibility. Now, if it's not supposed to be there and somebody violated a policy somewhere along the lines, we have a bit of a finger to point, but everyone's going to get named in the lawsuit. Everyone's going to have to run through everything. And the name of the game here is really understanding your data on a regular basis, because once you have it, it is yours. Once you have it and it's breached from your possession, you're going to be a part of that conversation regardless. So even if it's not there because it's not supposed to be there, or is there because it's not supposed to be there, if you're aware of it, you can engage proactively, you can engage in the hygiene, and even if and when something goes off the rails from that perspective, at least you can show the diligence and the ongoing measurements of there was a violation, this is our level of maturity around identifying and managing these things, and this is how we steer our ship moving forward. Now, data retention policies sound pretty simple, right? There's going to be some sets of data within the organization that I have to maintain for various reasons. And then there's going to be other sets of data within the organization that I cannot maintain longer than a certain amount of time. Now, exactly what these data types are, exactly what these controls are, this is going to be different based on the industry that you're working in, based on the size of your company, based on the types of customers that you have. Colloquially, I've worked with a few municipalities that have actually conflicting requirements when it comes to their data retention policies. As municipal policy, and I don't know if it's quite a law or municipal policy, they are not supposed to be storing their citizen records for any longer than, I believe it's 5 years in the case that I'm thinking about. Now, from a government tax perspective, they want all incident records stored for at least 7 years. And there's an overlap in terms of the citizen data that's involved in those incidents and the citizen data that needs to be purged after a certain amount of time. I really use it as an example because data retention policies seem like a simple concept, but like everything else, we humans like to make things harder on ourselves than possible. So there very, very well may be a time where you walk yourself into, I have competing requirements here. I literally can't meet both of my retention policies. The only thing that you're going to be able to do in that scenario is measure what you have, show what you're doing, and then reasonably engage those two parties, come to the table and figure out something that makes sense. Without the measurements, without the ability to be able to point to what's there and what you can actually do about it, that's a gut level conversation, and that's just going to end up in a finger pointing exercise where the responsibility is going to be back on you to just figure it out at the end of the day anyway. So there's data that we need to be keeping, there's data that we need to be getting rid of, right? Beyond just the age of it, there's a lot more to consider than just the age of the files, as we're going to go through this here. As you approach new compliance requirements, as you approach new and changing insurance requirements, you're going to have changes and increases to your data retention policies. All of a sudden, you're going to be required to track and store and prove that you're retaining certain sets of information within the confines of certain control systems for certain lengths of time to facilitate audit. That can come up at any point across these various compliance frameworks. Right, your insurance company may also come in at any point throughout these processes and say, I'm concerned about how long you're persisting and storing some of this sensitive information, because from our perspective, if that principal amount of your sensitive data gets compromised in a breach, we're going to be on the hook for that in terms of payouts. So at the end of the day, we really need to be measuring our data on a regular basis, and not only understanding how much of it we have and how old it is to align up to these retention policies. To do this effectively, I really need to understand the sensitivity of the data, where my sensitivity is at risk, and then bring those measurements and bring that reality back into the conversation as well. So just a couple examples here. Off the top of my head, something that we talk about a lot is the semi-recent Sobeys breach. A large grocer chain had a considerable amount of their employee data caught up in a breach, which means now the organization is on the hook for identity theft insurance for all of those employees, plus any of the other financial impacts for the rest of the data that was breached, right? So that was employee information. Customers don't like you holding on to any information that you don't really need for any length of time beyond when you need it, because if their information is breached from your systems, again, that information can be used against them. It can be used to attack their identities. It can be used to attack their reputations. It can be used to attack their job status. There's a multitude of different ways where people's information, especially their personal information, is being used against them. And if that information was breached from one of your systems, like I say, you might be able to navigate the conversation effectively, but you're in the conversation regardless if you have that data in the first place and it's breached. Right, so not only from a customer and employee perspective, just the users of your system in general have a basic expectation of any information that they put into your system to be kept safe from a protection and from a privacy perspective. And again, if it gets caught up in a breach where they can't really see how that information is used against them, that's one thing. But once that is used against them, now all of a sudden they are a part of that conversation, and you are a part of that conversation as well. So we have a lot of data, right? The reality is we don't really know how much data we have or what it is or where it's at risk of any level of exposure unless we're measuring these things on a regular basis. And I say a regular basis because once a year or once a half or once a quarter, it's frankly not enough. Your data materially changes every week in terms of people pulling new data down, deleting things, copying and replicating things, overexposing, underexposing your data. You know, people committing to the fact that they deleted and purged something, but then not really realizing there was some server replication node at play. So even though they thought they deleted everything under the retention policy, they actually didn't. So again, unless your retention policies themselves are baked into your overall data measurement scheme, system, overall solution, you're just going to be able to do kind of like a best effort. And then when that audit happens, it's going to be an easy conversation or a bit of a rigmarole to get through. And the last point here too is particularly important, right? Like data retention policy, how long do I need to keep something? When is it okay to get rid of it? That's enough to just check the box as long as I'm doing that based on the age of a file. But from an overall ability to protect the data, protect who the data belongs to, protect the impact back to the organization when that information gets breached, you know, it's not about just deleting data and keeping data. I need to understand it, right? I need to understand the level of sensitivity it presents to me in terms of an impact of how that's going to affect my organization when some of that data is caught up in a breach. So part of my data retention policies have to include data protection, right? And if I don't know what it is, where it is, how sensitive it is, especially where it's offside or just sitting in unexpected or out of bounds places, that's where that data is most at risk of getting caught up in a breach in the first place, which means it's most likely going to get breached from those locations. And again, if you need to keep that data, you can't just delete it. So now you need to figure out ways to protect it, especially knowing that data proliferates, right? We kind of jokingly say data is a lot like water. If there is a path for it to move somewhere, it's going to move somewhere, even seemingly on its own, due to the nice helpful auto sync features from various cloud services and on-prem deployments, or even just people downloading copies of things that they don't even realize they're pulling down because of misplaced storage things 7 layers deep in someone's SharePoint drive, for example. So I said we're going to be quick on this one, so I'm going to try to wrap this up in the next 5 to 10 minutes here. What I'm going to do, I'm going to jump into a bit of an overview of our platform just to really drive home, once you really understand what all of your data is, how sensitive it is, who has access to it. And that's a particularly good point. I'm going to bring that up as a part of the demo here. Who has access to your data and who's been using your data are principal things when it comes to your retention story. So what I mean by that, let's say, for example, I've got a server out here with a considerable amount of information on it, and all of a sudden I cross a line and 30% of that data comes up under my, now it's either safe to delete this because I no longer have to store it, or I must look at purging this data because now it's under a must purge policy, whatever angle of a data retention conversation that we're talking about. But who has access to that data is incredibly important, right? There's some solutions out there that will come in and be able to answer questions like, well, how old is the file? And if it's older than a certain date, it's after my retention policy, so let's just automatically delete it. So that's a bit of a naive way to go about automating data retention policies, because the question comes, well, what happens when 3 of the people on your executive team have been accessing some of those documents 3 times a day for the last 3 weeks? And then now all of a sudden an automatic purge process comes in and says, well, this data is old. It's technically within our ability to delete this. So let's delete it and let's move on. Well, then the phone calls and the emails start. Why can't I get access to the slide deck that we need to close this big deal for the end of the quarter, which is 3 days away? What do you mean you just purged all of this stuff? I don't know what I need to do to be able to keep that within, must keep stored as a part of the organization, but let me at least have the option to be able to go through and signal, hey, for whatever reason, I've got a bunch of my assets that are marked for retention deletion, but I need these, right? This is something that my team is working on. This is critical for us to use. I can't just go off and delete that. So if you understand who's actually using your data, which is something that the Cabello platform helps you with, again, you're going to have that sober second look in terms of, well, we can be deleting this, but I've got some questions here that we need to ask and run through as an organization to determine if that's an operationally, poor step to make. And then on the other side of things, right, before I delete it, let's talk about the data that we need to store. Right, one of the examples that I use quite a bit, and let's see if this works out here. I always talk about an organization collecting driver's license information to validate the identity of their new employees or their new vendors or their customers, for example. So I'm going to have to keep this data, right? This is sensitive data used against validation of identity processes, which means there's going to be a lot of requirements on where that data is stored, how it's stewarded, how it's protected. And that how it's protected is the big thing that I want to laser in on here. Right, my data retention policy is I'm going to have to keep those driver's license numbers stored somewhere for a considerable amount of time, because that's people's private information. And if it ever gets breached, I need to be able to prove that it wasn't breached from my system. Right, now there's a couple things here, right? We come in and we scan your environment for vulnerabilities. One of the other stories I tell on a regular basis is, imagine you do the impossible and you patch every single vulnerability in your environment every single day, and you never have one that's exposed. And then someone gets an email with a link in it, and they click on it, and then now potentially every piece of data that that person has access to from that asset has now been exposed to the person who sent them that phishing email in the first place. If that person had access to the drive or the system where all those driver's licenses are stored, I just exfiltrated that entire set of information that I knew was there, that I knew I needed to keep. I knew all the reasons I needed to keep it, but one click of a link just exposed all of that information. Versus if I have an eye on my retention policies, and I'm also thinking about this from a protection and a liability minimization perspective, I'm going to go have the conversation, right? Based on the team doing the identity checks, how much of this information do you really need sitting in the clear on a regular basis to do your job effectively? It's probably not the last 8 years worth of data that we've been collecting this, right? If you only need the last 3 or 4 weeks of data sitting there accessible at runtime to do your jobs, great. Let's take all of the rest of years of that data and move it behind runtime encryption or username and password access. Again, right, let's assume the fact that someone's going to click on that link at some point when you don't expect. It's going to expose the data set that you don't want exposed or can't just simply delete your way away from. So now I not only have to make sure I know where it is, I need to make sure it's staying in the places that I'm well primed to protect it. And I need to make sure that I'm protecting as much of it as humanly possible. And this isn't just from attacks at my edge and attacks through vulnerability exploits. This is literally just a human being making a mistake and clicking on something when they shouldn't and exposing a system and exposing the data therein. Right, so again, to help with that, regularly scanning where all of this data is, really understand the volume. That's going to allow you to have the internal conversations to say, how much of this can I reasonably apply additional layers of protection to, because I'm worried about a phishing campaign putting this at risk. And then just like you want to know, well, who's been working with a particular file or set of data before I just go and delete it because I can, because it's within my policies to do so. When it comes to this, where I need to keep my data, well, now I also need to understand, well, who has access to it in the first place, right? So even if I move, 80% of those driver's license numbers behind runtime encryption, if I still have 300 people in the organization who have access to that data on that drive, on that system, that's 300 people that can click on a link on a bad day, right? If only 4 of them are actually engaged in the activity that requires access to that information, I can take my access model and I can severely reduce that, right? Let's not have 300 people have access to information that they don't need and put 300 people at risk of clicking on a link on any given day to expose information that they might not even know exists within the organization, but again, have no real need to be using. Let's only give the people who need access to it, because someone is going to make a mistake at some point and have that data exposed. So again, no matter which perspective you're looking at it from a retention perspective, I need to make sure that I understand what everything is, where it is. I need to understand that the things that I'm going to delete aren't in active use or aren't an active need by anyone in my organization. The things that I can't just delete my way away from, I need to understand, well, where is that data at risk for vulnerabilities and weak config? But I can't just ask that question. I also have to ask, where is that data at risk because of an overexposed access model? So the whole goal here, right, was to give you a little bit more to think about in terms of data retention policies and how measuring your data, specifically understanding the sensitivity to it and the risk of exposure to it, not just from vulnerabilities, but from your access model itself, are all things you need to consider ongoing as a regular concept of data hygiene that is going to support your retention policies at the end of the day. Otherwise, you're going to be keeping too much of the wrong data and it's going to be overexposed to someone clicking on a link at some point. Or you risk prematurely deleting a bunch of data that is in active need of the organization. And all of those things can likely lead to a bigger financial impact to the organization than whatever mishandling the retention policy might very well look like. Cool. So I'm going to stop there. I've thrown a lot at you in terms of kind of overloading the data retention conversation. I would be super curious to see if anybody feels the same way that I feel about this, if people have different looks on this, or you think I'm just kind of taking a left field take on this. I would love to know, so please reach out and give us that feedback. If you have any particular questions here on this call, just go ahead and drop that into the chat. I'm not seeing anything just yet, but I'll just give it a minute. And if I don't see anything come in, again, as always, please check out cabello.com. We've got a lot of information up there. Please reach out to me directly if you have any questions. Please reach out to the team directly if you have any questions. There's always new stuff going up online. And as a part of our new Connect series, you can expect to hear more technology and use case focused conversations in terms of data discovery, data classification, and data protection. And again, with the hope that people begin to understand, I really just need to measure all this on a regular basis to make good decisions when it comes to a lot of different use cases as it relates back to my data. Great, so I don't see any final questions here. So I'm gonna thank everyone for attending. Again, please check out cavello.com and reach out. Let's have this conversation one-on-one. Let's go through a deeper demo. Let's talk about how Cavello as a platform and as an organization can help you move through any of your particular data needs. Thank you.